Imagine a grand 1930s ballroom filled with glittering chandeliers and whispered rumors of an heiress whose fortune could buy nations. Step inside and meet Barbara Woolworth Hutton, the poor little rich girl whose wealth and glamour dazzled even the most jaded socialites. But beneath the sparkle of her fabled jewelry and the elegance of her couture lay a hidden world of heartbreak, self-doubt, and a desperate search for genuine affection. From marrying playboys and European aristocrats to stumbling through loneliness and addiction, Barbara's life became a mesmerizing clash between fairytale privilege and private torment. Join us as we journey through her story of brilliance and tragedy, a cautionary tale of how immense fortune can wither in the absence of real connection. Barbara Woolworth Hutton entered the world in a swirl of extraordinary promise and devastating tragedy on November 14, 1912, in the heart of New York City. Even her birthplace seemed charged with possibility. Skyscrapers rose toward the clouds, automobiles replaced horse-drawn carriages, and the entire nation buzzed with the heady optimism of the early 20th century. At first glance, one might assume her life would be gilded from the start, a smooth path laid out before her by virtue of her immense inheritance. Her maternal lineage traced back to Frank W. Woolworth, the founder of the famed five and dime stores that changed America's retail landscape. Meanwhile, her father, Franklin Laws Hutton, co-founded the brokerage firm E.F. Hutton and Company, a name that became synonymous with financial prowess. It was as if Barbara were heir to twin rivers of wealth, each flooding her life with unimaginable resources. By the time she turned 12, she had inherited roughly $28 million, a vast fortune in 1920s currency, and by her 21st birthday that sum had grown to more than $40 million, thanks to her father's investments. If one measures wealth by modern standards, she was effectively a billionaire before she was old enough to order a drink. And yet behind the numerical figures that dazzled the public and the press, the essential contours of Barbara's life would be carved by heartbreak, loneliness, and the near-constant search for love. She was only 4 years old when she stumbled upon the scene that would haunt her for the rest of her life. On that day in 1916, the bright chatter of the household gave way to suffocating silence, when young Barbara, no more than a curious toddler, opened a door and found her mother, Edna Woolworth, lifeless. Officially, Edna's death was attributed to complications from mastoiditis, an infection that had turned catastrophic. Yet rumors flew behind the walls of polite society, whispers that Edna had taken her own life due to her husband's infidelities. Barbara's mother was just 33 when she died. For a little girl who could barely grasp the concept of finality, let alone the complexities of marital betrayal, the result was a potent mix of trauma, confusion, and guilt. She would later recall in halting admissions how that moment fractured her sense of security forever. In a world that might have offered her endless comfort, Barbara felt alone from the very beginning. Her father, Franklin, was not the warm paternal figure she might have needed to heal from the shock. Emotionally distant, he responded to his wife's death by packing Barbara off to live with relatives and governesses, as though his child were more of an item on a to-do list than a person requiring love and guidance. The result was that Barbara grew up in mansions where the staff was polite, the linens impeccably pressed, and every meal served on fine china, yet genuine warmth was harder to find. By the time she was a teenager, she had formed a shell around herself, a mixture of social awkwardness and deep longing, rarely letting anyone close enough to see the raw scars beneath her polished exterior. When she turned 18, the world caught its first major glimpse of Barbara Hutton in all her glitz and glory, at her debutante ball at the Ritz-Carlton in 1930. The event was rumored to cost $60,000, a king's ransom, in an era when breadlines and unemployment figures dominated daily headlines. It was the Great Depression, and Americans who could scarcely afford to feed their families looked on with a mix of resentment and fascination. The newspapers quickly branded her "poor little rich girl," a moniker that stuck. While the label might have seemed paradoxical to anyone outside her gilded circle, it carried a kernel of brutal truth. She was wealthy beyond measure, yet often bereft of the simple emotional bonds that sustain most people. That night at the Ritz, among the glittering gowns and the orchestras, Barbara stood on the cusp of adulthood, a slender figure who would soon become known not just for her fortune, but for a series of decisions that made her life a public spectacle. The press loved her. They feasted on every detail of her acquisitions. The glittering necklaces once owned by European royalty, the wardrobe from Balenciaga or Schiaparelli or whomever was the pinnacle of haute couture at the moment, and the stunning properties she owned: Winfield House in London, a palace in Tangier, multiple residences scattered like pearls across the globe. She was a socialite in the purest sense, drifting between lavish parties, mingling with European aristocrats, Hollywood icons, and powerful industrialists. In the 1940s, her style influenced fashion magazines, landing her in vogue and turning her into something like a fairy tale figure, the princess with endless resources, rumored to hold in her jewelry box pieces that had once graced Marie Antoinette's neck or the wrists of Russian grand duchesses. Yet behind the sparkle, Barbara's personal life was already spinning like a broken carousel, too fast, too noisy, and with no one quite sure how to make it stop. In fact, before she hit her mid-20s, Barbara had already discovered how precarious her relationships could be, especially given that her fortune acted like a magnet for opportunists. Her first marriage at the age of 20 set the tone. Alexis Mandavani, who styled himself as a Georgian prince, swept her off her feet with romantic gestures, only for the scandal-hungry press to reveal that he had demanded $1 million up front before the wedding, plus a princely annual allowance. The newspapers had a field day labeling Barbara naive, a childlike woman who could so easily be taken in by a charming con man. Just 2 years into the marriage, Alexis walked away with a hefty sum, leaving Barbara both humiliated and newly aware that people might want her more for her checkbook than her heart. It was a harsh lesson, one she would unfortunately revisit many times over. Not long after, she encountered Count Kurt Haugwitz Reventlow, a Danish aristocrat with an impeccable pedigree and a shockingly abusive streak. He was physically and emotionally violent, and to please him, Barbara did something drastic. She renounced her U.S. citizenship in favor of Danish nationality. This outraged many Americans, not just because it seemed unpatriotic, but also because it exposed her as a woman driven by desperation. The union produced her only child, Lance, who was born in 1936. Yet the relationship soon disintegrated amid allegations of violence, and by the time the dust settled in the divorce courts, a bitter custody battle ensued. The press lapped it up, painting Barbara either as a battered wife or an unfit mother, depending on which headline sold more papers that week. For Barbara, it was another milestone of heartbreak, reinforcing her suspicion that love might always come wrapped in barbed wire. Her third marriage seemed, at least on the surface, to be a fairy tale, none other than the Hollywood charmer Cary Grant. It was 1942, and the union of a movie star at the height of his fame and one of the world's richest women was catnip for the tabloids. Unlike her previous husbands, Grant was not a fortune hunter. He famously refused her money. insisting on paying his own bills, a gesture that must have seemed almost miraculous to Barbara. For a brief, shining moment, it appeared she might have found real love, free from the manipulative undertones that had plagued her earlier relationships. However, the glamour of their combined star power could not overcome the fundamental differences in their personalities and lifestyles. Cary Grant was focused on his career and wanted a more grounded life. Barbara, forever chasing validation, sank deeper into insecurity. By 1945, they parted ways, leaving fans disillusioned that even Hollywood's golden couple couldn't make it work. As the years went by, Barbara's marital tally rose to 7, each new husband bringing fresh waves of scandal, heartbreak, and public scrutiny. Prince Igor Trubetskoy, a Russian exile and race car enthusiast, walked into her life in the late 1940s. He offered a glamorous veneer, another title name, another dash of exotic flair, but rumors abounded that he was yet another fortune hunter. Then came Porfirio Rubirosa, the Dominican playboy so notorious for romancing wealthy women that his exploits became the stuff of legend. Their marriage lasted a mere 73 days, and Rubirosa walked away with a reported $1 million settlement and a private plane, proving once again that Barbara's longing for love had a habit of leaving her poorer, both financially and emotionally. The tabloids covered every twist and turn, often portraying her as a lonely heiress, unable to distinguish genuine affection from money-fueled flattery. The pattern repeated itself with her 5th and 6th marriages, first to Baron Gottfried von Kram, a handsome German tennis star rumored to be gay, which sparked speculation that the marriage was an arrangement for mutual convenience. Then, in the mid-1960s, to Prince Pierre d'Onvin, a Laotian painter with a minor royal title, a relationship so obscure that many in the press treated it as an afterthought, as if Barbara's serial weddings had lost their power to shock. By then, public sympathy was giving way to a kind of weary pity. She seemed caught in a cycle, always searching, always exploited, always left emptier than before. But Barbara's struggles were not confined to the matrimonial stage. Even as she collected art and hosted parties that cost as much as a middle-class family's entire annual income, she was battling demons that gnawed at her behind closed doors. From her teenage years onward, she struggled with anorexia nervosa, an illness fueled by the era's emphasis on thinness as a marker of elegance. Coupled with the relentless stress of paparazzi attention and her own deep-seated insecurities, she often ate little and appeared frail, her delicate frame accentuated by the couture gowns she wore. Friends and acquaintances would remark on how the slightest adversity could send her retreating into her large, empty dining rooms, picking at salads she barely touched or sipping champagne until the early hours of the morning. Inevitably, substance use became another coping mechanism. She began taking prescription drugs, Seconal was frequently mentioned, both to ease her anxiety and to help her sleep in a world she found increasingly hostile. Alcohol provided another crutch, and as she grew older, rumors of recreational drug use surfaced, especially in the bohemian corners of Tangier or the glitzy parties of Beverly Hills. Her mental health suffered visibly, culminating in depressive episodes that sometimes required hospitalization or stints in rehab clinics. But these interventions rarely stuck. Each time she emerged, it seemed she had shed a little more of her confidence, retreating further into a swirl of paranoia that everyone in her orbit was out to take advantage of her. Arguably, the greatest blow to Barbara's fragile psyche came in 1972 with the death of her son, Lance Raventlow. Their relationship was complicated from the start. Barbara's irregular presence and her constant tumult had overshadowed Lance's childhood. Though he was raised with every privilege, he chafed at the same sense of paternal absence that Barbara had endured. As a young man, he became a race car driver, ironically courting the kind of danger from which Barbara had spent years trying to protect herself. When Lance died in a plane crash at just 36, Barbara was irrevocably shattered. It was as if the last tether connecting her to a hopeful vision of life snapped in an instant. She never fully recovered from the blow, sinking deeper into her addictions and rarely appearing in public, except for brief, unsettling glimpses. Friends and acquaintances noted that she seemed to walk in a fog, her once vibrant eyes dulled by grief and medication. All the while, her staggering fortune was draining away like water through a cracked vessel. She had once been worth, by modern estimates, nearly $1 billion. But her lavish spending habits were legendary. $1 million parties, a private plane for weekend getaways, and untold sums showered upon so-called friends and suitors who promised her love. On top of that, she was surrounded by advisors of questionable integrity, some of whom steered her into disastrous investments or simply siphoned off her funds. E.F. Hutton and company itself faced scrutiny over the management of her trust. By the 1970s, the combination of outlandish extravagance, bad advice, and unscrupulous behavior from those around her meant she had burned through almost everything. The press that once chronicled her lavish lifestyle now documented her decline with the same eagerness, turning it into a grim morality tale. The poor little rich girl who lost it all. As her finances dwindled, her health followed the same tragic curve downward. Years of anorexia, alcohol and drug abuse, and emotional turmoil had left her body weak and prone to complications. Heart problems loomed, along with other chronic ailments that turned each day into a struggle. By the late 1970s, Barbara found herself residing not in a grand mansion, but in a suite at the Beverly Wilshire Hotel in California, a far cry from the lavish estates she once called home. The tabloids and newspapers, which had once documented her every move with breathless fascination, now cast her as a figure of pity, an old photograph left in a dusty album, a cautionary footnote in stories about wealth and folly. On May 11, 1979, Barbara's story reached its final sorrowful page when she died of a heart attack at the Beverly Wilshire. She was 66 years old. Only a few close acquaintances marked her passing. There were no massive crowds of mourners, no ceremonial farewells. Even more jarring was the revelation that her estate amounted to a mere $3,500, hardly enough to buy one of the diamond-studded bracelets she had once casually gifted to a lover or friend decades before. And so ended the life of a woman who, for a time, symbolized the very heights of privilege, a life that soared and crashed with equal drama, leaving behind a legacy as the ultimate poor little rich girl. Yet her story did not vanish in that solitary hotel room. It lingered in popular culture, becoming a symbol of both fascination and admonition. Documentaries, biographies, and dramatizations recounted the improbable arc of Barbara's life, an heiress drowning in unimaginable wealth, perpetually short on genuine human connection. One of the most cited works is Poor Little Rich Girl, The Life and Legend of Barbara Hutton by C. David Heyman, among others who sought to peel back the veneer of glamour and show the raw vulnerability beneath. While some portrayals veered into sensationalism, dwelling on the flamboyant parties or the jaw-dropping divorces, others showed a woman whose early trauma set the stage for every misstep that followed. To many, she remains a cautionary tale about the hollowness that can lie beneath immense material abundance. Her repeated pursuits of love through marriage after marriage, her devotion to men who seemed determined to milk her fortune, and her reliance on substances to numb her emotional pain exemplify the pitfalls of a life unmoored from authentic emotional support. The lesson gleaned by observers is that money cannot fill certain chasms, particularly those carved by loneliness, childhood trauma, or the absence of stable family bonds.